Good morning. Thank you very much for inviting me here to this conference. As I say, Doug McIver. I'm now working as an assessor for BSI in Riyadh, so welcome to sunny Riyadh. It's my hometown now, so good to see you. I previously worked for 17 years under the MHRA. It's a bit unusual, but I have my present boss here, Michelle, and my old boss, Alan Kent, here. So I've got to be on best behaviour. So, just an introduction. I want to talk about first this is my opinion of the key changes in the regulatory field for post-market surveillance. Unfortunately, the gentleman who was supposed to give this talk couldn't make it, so I was asked by the SFDA if I could stand in and give my opinion of the post-market regulatory controls and the key changes to this. So it is my opinion. I'm not representing BSI or the MHRA, who I worked for many years. This is just my take on the key updates. And I hope that you'll get something from this and the flavour, the changes to the new medical device regulations, which I'm informed by the MHRA are still on track to be draft finalised in June and then published by the end of the year. I don't think 3 months, but I think it's hopefully by the end of the year. Okay. I want to talk about the allocation of resources for regulatory compliance, the drivers behind regulatory developments, PIP and metal-on-metal hips. Now, these really were the drivers. This explains all the changes, and then actually discuss some of the changes in the regulatory environment. Right. The allocation of resources. So, as you're aware, in 2008, there was an economic crash in Europe and most of the world. There was severe cash shortages for governments, government departments, and this is still going on. So regulation has to be put into the context of finance. In the United Kingdom, the Department of Health is actually cutting a third of its Department of Health civil servants in the summer. The MHRA is avoiding this by becoming fully self-funding from industry. So I think you can understand the cash shortages in the field for regulatory, which will put the burden on manufacturers. The FDA is seen as the gold standard for pre-market approval. So I was very interested earlier in our talk from Petra about, I hadn't seen those figures before, about really is there much difference in the actual systems and the quality of the systems, whereas the FDA, the pre-market approval, the last figures I saw in 2011 were $378 million to run just the medical device FDA bit, with only 52 million being recovered. So this is a massive expense compared to the post-market system of Europe. Now, that's basically, we do not have the money to set up a new pre-market approval system, so we've just got to improve what we have. And we actually, in Europe, as regulators, really liked our system. As Petra again said, we really see it enhancing really see it enhancing the innovation, because you do get devices to market far sooner and more patients are saved. And it seems there is not really much of a greater risk to it. And also with our system, with the notified body involvement, it's very hands-on. They actually are, and it's getting more so. Audits, unannounced audits, the information they have to supply, the actual post-market follow-up reports, things like this. So the scrutiny is just getting more and more. And we like that system as well. I know it's overburdensome, but hopefully MD-SAP will help that. Right. I really wanted to talk first about PIP. Now, I remember Christmas of 2010 like it was yesterday. It was bloody madness at the MHRA. And I think most regulators will tell you the same, and for many regulators, it hasn't really stopped. There was once or twice when we couldn't actually leave the MHRA building in London because of protesters outside and cameramen and so forth. So I cannot tell you the impact this had on the regulators, and I think this is the driver for this is the real driver for change. And if you understand this, what actually went on, you will understand everything, and it really will make sense. Basically, who had what implant? There were 40,000 UK women with breast implants in the UK. Now, many of them had those breast implants removed, but they didn't know if they were affected PIP breast implants. So this has a tremendous effect on the good health of patients if you don't know who's got what. And then it's got to be remembered that PIP was fraud. It was complete and utter fraud. The finance officer and the owner of the company went to prison for fraud. And so you can't actually stop that. Really, ultimately, you cannot stop fraud. But you can have a good go at it with unannounced audits. And the problem was non-medical grade materials. So you can try and get at the suppliers and check what they are supplying, the critical suppliers, again with unannounced audits. And then I think, as my colleague so well explained earlier, non-reporting of problems. If you don't know it's a problem, there is nothing you can do about it. You really need those reports, so thank you for making that point as well. There's a few solutions underneath, but I'll go on and talk a bit further about them. So just cheat cards. I just wanted to talk about what I see, and this is my own personal opinion, of the key updates to the medical device post-market regulatory control. And these are the vital changes, and all of these changes actually address those issues. Who had what where, post-market surveillance, and actual surveillance of the manufacturers. UDI, unique device identification. It's defined according to the MDR as a series of numeric or alphanumeric characters that is created through a globally accepted device identification and coding standard. Every device will have company and product details, and it will include the GNDM code, what the product basically is. Some devices will also have to contain product information, batch numbers, etc. Now, you convey the UDI information by using an automatic identification and data capture system. We know this as linear and matrix barcodes. So everything is going to be barcoded, and we'll have all that detail. The European Union hasn't actually settled yet, but it's felt it will be the GS1 system, I'm sure of it, and it will be the healthcare industry barcode standard as well. So these will be the main, I believe, barcoding for devices. One of the big changes as well is EUDAMED. Right. EUDAMED is the European database on medical devices. Now, this is going to be a web-based portal. It's still in the future, but it's going to be the answer to a lot of your questions earlier. It was originally designed as a repository for information exchange between the competent authorities and the Commission. Now, that has completely changed now. That is going to be, UDI will be on this database. Vigilance information should be on this database. The Commission Expert Panel report should be on the database, and notified body information and certificates will probably be on this database, so you will be able to see what's current. And the biggest thing is they want transparency. They actually want device users and the public to see this information. There is nothing better than the light of day to clean up. And so EUDAMED will be the fundamental of this. Now, it's still in the future. It's going to come. It's going to be funded probably by the Commission, but it will be taken in charges. And again, I have to say with cost, the costs in Europe are going to go up, without doubt. But, you know, it's not going to be anything like the American system. And hopefully. Vigilance. Again, the EUDAMED is going to be the single reporting portal for vigilance reports. Now, this will include field safety corrective actions, field safety notices. All of these should be put onto the EUDAMED database and will be made open to the public. Now, as a regulator in Europe, we had terrible trouble. You'd get a manufacturer, you'd have issues, and you'd get a manufacturer in, and they'd say, oh, we've only had a few reports in the UK, it's user issues. And eventually you'd have a few more reports, and then you'd contact Germany or America, and they'd say, oh, no, we've got exactly the same. So a single portal for all the competent authorities is a very powerful tool, and it should help us to actually, the regulators to find out what's really going on. And as was mentioned about the medical device expert group at the Commission is taking a far more active role for the actual regulation of medical devices. They have had enough with the PIP of the nationals of, as you said earlier, it was seen that the competent authorities were not being taking enough steps to control medical device manufacturers. The notified bodies were not actually doing their job properly. And so the Commission is now taking a far more active part. The draft isn't yet finalised of the MDR because of there's still things that have to be done. The French want the expert panels, as you said earlier, the expert panels will look at clinical evidence, clinical documentation. There'll be the actual notified body clinical evaluation report will go into the expert groups, and the manufacturer's clinical evaluation documentation. And all these reports will actually be good and bad, what went wrong in the testing and what went right. So they're going to get a lot more information. But, and all of this should hopefully be on the UNIMED database. And the thing about these Commission expert panels is that they're actually going to be advisory. They want them to be advisory. So that a manufacturer, all through his development, can actually get advice from the expert panel. We don't know what the expert panel is going to look like yet. As I said, there's still differences in Europe, so we're still not completely sure what everything is going to look like. But we're hopeful. As I said, the French would like 2P. There's class 3 implantables will definitely go to the Commission. The French want 2B implantables to go to the Commission as well. So this is still work in progress. And then for notified bodies, you look at the changes are well known in notified bodies, as Paul discussed earlier. In 2013, the Commission published guidance on the designation and supervision of notified bodies and audits and assessments performed by notified bodies. So the changes that were coming within the MDR were actually warned about years ago and have actually to a great extent been put into practice. I know at the what will actually happen is 6 months after the new regulation comes into force, there will be the redesignation of all notified bodies. There was about 80. There's now, we think, about 50, and they think it will probably go down to 2030. So there will be need redesignation after 6 months. The MHRA is certain it's on track for that, and all of the British notified bodies will be redesignated within 6 months. And so there's been enough information out there for the last few years, so we don't foresee it in the UK as a problem. And as I say, these are what I see as the key changes in the new regulations. And just to show, and these all come about basically because of the PIP breast implants and the lack of device identification, the lack of scrutiny. And so if you look at the actual 10 chapters of the new medical device regulations, you'll actually see what I'm talking about. You've got the actual identification and traceability, notified bodies, conformity assessment changes, clinical evaluations, investigations, vigilance, market surveillance, cooperation between member states, the UNIMED portal, all sharing information. So you can see these are actually, these vital changes are actually reflected in the medical device regulation. Also, as a regulator, one of the key things is Chapter 1, the scope and definitions. It actually tells you now what goes into a declaration of conformity. It has to be the route to conformity, GNDM code, and all of your barcode details, GS1, whatever. So it's actually very prescriptive, and everything in it, it's gone from 40-odd pages to 220. It's very prescriptive, and that is a great help as a regulator and a manufacturer. You know what you're supposed to do. And we know what you're supposed to do, so we could then go in and actually make sure you're doing it. So the new directive is excellent like that. It's very prescriptive. Okay. And so I'd just like to, in conclusion, as I say, this is my understanding of it. We've got resource allocation. It will stay a post-market surveillance system. And that's very important. And I've been very pleased to see that there's really very little difference between post-market and pre-market. And I'd like to point out as well that PIP was actually received 510K clearance in '96. So you see, but no system is foolproof. I think discussed the driver for change, PIP, and metal on metal. There was much trouble with metal on metal hip prosthesis. They didn't actually realise the wearing would actually release small metal deposits and would actually have allergic adverse reaction within the body, and it would actually rot away the hips. And so this was another driver. This was really about the research, the clinical evidence, the post-market follow-ups. And we hope that it's really going to raise the bar. We are seeing this change in the directive, a change from a directive to a regulation, as raising the bar for everyone. The competent authorities now have to do the designation and supervision of the notified bodies. So we've got to get more expert. We've got to understand more. And so it's raising the bar, and then the notified bodies have to have the experts to actually go in and audit these companies. And the manufacturers have the expertise, and we've got to make sure they're using it properly. So the key changes, I think, the new draft regulations will reinforce the rights and obligations of the competent authorities. Rights and obligations. At the moment within Europe there are a few sort of super competent authorities, the MHRA, the French, the Germans, but everyone now has to take responsibility for their notified bodies and the designation of them. So that is an important change. The mechanism of surveillance for notified bodies responsible for conformity assessment. As I said, this has changed, and it's already pretty well it is in place, more or less, in the UK. Shadow audits, shadow unannounced audits, this has all been done. And the MHRA, my own company now, BSI, has been audited many times for these changes. So they are about ready in place. And I think one of the biggest changes will be a central governance role of the European Commission with the expert panels. And also there will be reference laboratories. I know Saudi is moving very much to this, wanting its own laboratories, its own testing. The Commission wants its own laboratories and testing. For instance, in the UK, we have the National Institute of Biological Standards and Controls. This is actually part of the MHRA, and they are putting that forward as for one of the IVD expert panels. So, that's the sort of thing the Commission are looking at. Department of Health, government laboratories that can help and do this. So again, much more scrutiny by the Commission. And just to finish, I just wanted to give you a few resources. I'm afraid I can't find the actual link, but if you take this Google search, you'll have the presentation, I'm sure, after. You can actually find the actual latest draft. It was September last year. It was the latest draft of the medical device regulations, about 220 pages. If you can't sleep at night, please read it. It's fantastic. I recommend it. And there's general advice on the changes to the European regulations, just general bits under the EU Commission website about the MDD revision, talking about the original drivers, the original proposals, so forth, and the UDI. As I say, I am sure GS1 will be one of the European UDI standards, and there's a very good explanation of the healthcare device UDIs on the GS1 portal. Okay. Right. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you. I'm sorry if it was a little rushed.